making these cute little gnomes. This is a finished glaze one, and here's another finished glaze one. So they have two different looks to them, and that's okay because I want each one of your gnomes to look individual and unique. These are basic. You're gonna make yours extra, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I wrote out instructions in Google Classroom, so make sure that you read over those in addition to watching this video. It's going to help you understand and know exactly what the expectations are for this project. All right, so a few things you will need. Pretty simple, you don't need a lot of stuff. You're gonna need clay. Obviously this is more clay than you will need to make this little gnome, so you don't need this much clay. You'll kind of get an eye, or you'll visually be able to tell how much clay I use as I start to make the gnome. You're gonna need a pencil of some sort, and there are a few tools that I would typically use, and I know that you guys don't have at home, so I'm gonna show you some substitutes for some things. So I'm gonna show you some things you can use in place of some of the other tools that I would more typically have us use in the classroom. So you need a pencil, or you can have like the edge of a paintbrush. You might want a paintbrush for smoothing, a sponge for smoothing. Those are all options that you might want to have to make your piece look nice and neat. The end of the paintbrush can also work in place of the pencil, so that's one thing to know. You're gonna need something to cut the clay with. Typically I use a clay knife, but I couldn't send those home with you guys. So a few options that I have for you. One, you can use a typical like house nail that you would use to hammer and nail something in, like into wood. So that's an option for sort of being able to cut the clay. If you have a popsicle stick still, you can cut the tip of this into a knife. The one thing about this is that it will be a little more fragile, so you want to cut gently, but you can cut your popsicle stick into a knife, and you can use this to cut some stuff out. Or if you have a knife that you can use a knife. You wouldn't want one that had like the serrated edge on it, so like all the little sharp teeth. So particularly if you were going to use like a plastic knife, they typically have the serrated edge on it, and that's what serrated means. So like all the little teeth on the end of it. All right. Another thing that you might want is like a rolling pin of some sort. I actually took this from my son's block collection. Don't tell him, he might get upset with me. But I think you can get away with just kind of pushing the clay out with your hand. So if you can find something that you can use like a rolling pin, it might be helpful for you. All right, so just to bring it all back together, clay, a paintbrush or something with a smooth edge on it similar to a pencil, and that's going to be to create this hole from the underneath so that we don't have a big solid block of clay at the bottom. You're going to also want, you're going to want your scoring tool. If you didn't get a scoring tool, if you didn't take yours with you, or if you never came to pick up your supplies and it's still sitting in a bag waiting for you in the classroom, you need to find something that you can rough up the edge with. So that plastic utensil that might have the serrated edge on it might work well, an old toothbrush, something along those lines, and you'll see what we do with it once we start working on it. Another thing that you're going to want is your little thing of slip. All right, so we have a knife, a paintbrush, your serrated tool, some clay, and some type of rolling pin. You might find that you don't actually need the rolling pin though. All right, so those are your materials. All right, we're gonna get started making the gnome. I am going to take a chunk of clay for the body, probably a little less, about the size of like one of those rubber balls that you would get from like a vending machine, those little bouncy balls. And I'm just gonna roll it into a nice ball. You can roll it on your surface or in your hands. I prefer in my hands. Then I want to sort of take that ball, and I'm just gonna roll the top of it so that I make it into what looks like a little cone without a point. So sort of like that. This is going to be the body of the gnome. So from here, if I tried to stand it up, it'd just fall over. So we need to flatten out the bottom. So I'm just going to tap it down. Until I get a shape that I like for the body. All right, so from here, I'm going to take either the pencil, I'll use the pencil since probably what you guys have, and I'm just going to stick it into the bottom to make a hole. I do this for 2 reasons. The first reason is we don't want a big solid chunk of clay. What typically will end up happening is the clay on the inside stays wet and the clay on the outside seems dry. And then when I go to fire it in the kiln, you have a little explosion because the clay on the inside is still wet and the steam wants to escape, so it finds its way out any way that it can. Another reason why we do it is just makes for better airflow and for everything to dry evenly, which even drying leads to less cracking. So we're just gonna put a hole in the bottom. All right, the next step that we're going to do is, and this is probably the most complicated part, we are going to make a beard. So I'm just gonna take another little chunk of clay, and again, I start by rolling it into a ball. This is the point where you might want to find something that can work like a rolling pin, but I'm going to show you how to do it without having a rolling pin. So I'm just going to smush down this chunk of clay with my palm. And notice that I keep flipping it. Helps to keep it from sticking and helps to just make your little slab piece a little bit more even. Another thing that you can do if you don't have a rolling pin or something to roll out with is you can kind of throw out the clay. It doesn't work as well with small amounts of clay as it does with large, but you'll just put it in your hand and you kind of want to throw it away from you. But you want your fingers to follow through so that it doesn't get all like wonky and out of control. If you just keep throwing it down flat, it's not going to make a difference. It's kind of that action of throwing it a little bit away from you that tends to stretch the clay out. And I just keep rotating it so that it doesn't get too long in one direction. For this little slab of clay, this is going to be the thickness of the beard, so we want something that's on the thinner side. You don't want to have a really thick beard sticking off of the gnome. So I'm just going to throw it out just a little bit more. It's aggressive. And I can feel that it's a little thicker in the middle, but that's okay because after I cut out the beard shape, I will thin it out with my fingers a little bit. All right, so I am going to use the popsicle stick with the tip cut into like the shape of a knife. I'm going to make a very basic beard shape. You can get as fancy as you want. This is where you can start to give it some personality. And I'm just going to make like a U shape to make the beard. If or what I like to do first is kind of just draw it. And make sure that I like the shape of it before I cut it. Okay. In my opinion, I think it's better to make it a little bit larger than you think you'll need, and you could always trim it down a little bit. If you make it too small, then you gotta do it all over again, and that's no fun. All right, so right now, this is way thicker than I want it to be, so I'm gonna hold up my beard and see how it fits in relation to the body that I made, and it's pretty good size relationship. So I'm going to just pinch the ends out a little bit to make them a little thinner. And it also takes it from looking like a cut chunk of clay, so like that looks cut, has a sharp edge, to something that looks a little smoother. All right, so in that, doing that might have made this a little bigger than I want it to be, so I'm just gonna hold it back up to my gnome And I'm gonna see how the size is. So it's a little big. I actually like to tuck a little bit over. So I'm gonna leave it. If your piece is really, really big, you could just take your knife tool and kind of mark it where it should stop and then put it back down on a flat surface and trim it. All right, so from here, I'm going to score the back of the beard. So I'm just roughing it up with my scoring tool. You guys have these little guys at home. It's the same thing. And then at the same time, I'm adding some slip to it to make it nice and slippy and scored. I'm going to pick the most, like, I'm gonna pick the spot on this little cone that I made that looks like the sloppiest, and I'm gonna put the beard right over that. So I might as well cover up a sloppy part. So I'm just going to, and a good thing to do is if you take your beard piece and put it on with all that slip and stuff on it, it will leave behind like a marking as to where it fits, and that way you don't over score. It's not a big deal if you do, you just have to go back and clean it up. So I like to avoid cleanup as much as possible, and that's one way that I can avoid extra cleanup. All right, so then I'm going to stick my beard on. And smush it down. So it doesn't really look like much of anything right now, but it will, I promise. My clay is a little dry. It's getting a little cracking in it. So to fix that, I can just take a paintbrush, or I can take my finger that has some slip on it and just kind of smooth over that area. I prefer a paintbrush, but if you don't have one, your finger will work fine. And you want to make sure that it is nice and pressed down on all the sides. And the paintbrush is also good for going back and kind of cleaning up any slip that poured out. So if you don't have a paintbrush, I recommend finding one that you could use. All right, so I have my beard attached to my body. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make the lines of the beard, and I'm just going to use a pencil. My pencil's a little dull. I wish I had one that was a little sharper, but I don't have a pencil sharpener down here. So I'm just going to use the pencil to draw some lines in to create the texture for the beard. Don't worry if pencil gets in your clay, it will burn out in the kiln. All right, so I drew some lines in. The paintbrush is nice to go over those lines and just to smooth out any little like clay scraps that may have formed while you were carving those lines out. You could also wait to carve those lines once the clay has set up a little bit. Sometimes you get a neater line. For this, for most of the time, I do like to carve when the clay has set up a little bit more. But for this, I like to carve early on because I want those lines to look softer. I don't want them to be so sharp and so clean looking. All right, so starting to look like a gnome. The next thing that I'm gonna do is I'm going to take like a little tiny bit of clay, like a little, like we were eating edamame for lunch, so like a little edamame or like a pea or something along those lines, maybe a little bit bigger than a pea. And I'm just going to roll it into a ball and then roll it out into a cone so that it looks a little like this. And then I always hold it up to my gnome and see, like, do I like the size? I like the size. So now I'm going to just score the top of this. This top piece is going to get covered by the hat, so if I overscore a little bit, it's okay, because the hat is going to go right on top of it and you won't see it in the long run. So I'm going to score the end of this and add some slip. And then I'm just going to push this down. It's important that when you're scoring and slipping, especially if you don't want to change the shape, that you apply some pressure so that we really make sure that it's attached. A little wiggle is always helpful too. So wiggle, wiggle, press, press. All right, we're getting there. The next step is going to be to make the hat. So I'm going to take a little bit more clay, probably a little less than the amount of clay that I used to make the body. And again, I start with rolling it into a nice smooth ball. That way, the neater the shape I start with is, the nicer the whatever form I'm making ends up. All right, so after I make it into a ball, then I'm going to roll it out sort of like I would a coil. So I just start by rolling it in my hands to make it longer. And then I'm going to put it on my board and I'm just going to roll out a little bit. And I'm just going to taper the top of it. This might be a little too much, so I'm just going to take my knife tool and cut off some. Again, comparing it, I'm gonna kind of roll this tip down a little bit so that it is not so tall, but I think that's pretty good shape. So I want it to be able to fit on top of my gnome's head. So I need to form this a little bit. So I'm just going to try, and I can start by using the pencil, or I can just use my finger. And I'm just gonna go and pinch the edges. And I'm smoothing a little as I go, because as I pinch, this is getting really narrow and I don't want it to change its shape too much. So I'm just going to pinch this little part at the bottom so that I'm making it able to fit the shape of the top of my gnome. The end part was getting a little too thin, so I'm just taking my, a little bit of slip on the edge of my finger, on the tip of my finger, and I'm just gonna smooth around that edge just to soften the clay up, and it will help me make the hat nice and neat too. All right, I'm gonna look at the hat in comparison to my gnome. It's good. All right, so my next step is going to be to score and add slip to the inside of the hat, as well as the top of my gnome's head. So from here, I'm just gonna move it around a little bit to see which direction I like it. So cute. Right now, this hat is pointing way back, and I want to change that, or else he will fall over once he's done. So before I go for the placement, while it's not on the body, I am just going to get this cone part to sort of change its shape so that it's sticking up and more forward than it is backwards, because it will make your gnome become top heavy and sort of flip back. This guy's hat is a little backwards, and he has a tendency to want to go back a little bit. All right, so once I find the placement, then I'm going to really make sure that I press down. I don't want to distort the shape of anything that I made, so I'm just pressing lightly, but I'm making sure that I'm doing it in all the spots where it needs to be attached. All right, so from here, I'm going to change the shape of this hat. And I'm gonna get it to twist forward a little bit. So all I'm gonna do is kind of with a wet finger, just kind of encourage it to go forward. And I can make it curl around as much or as little as I want. I just want to make sure that there isn't a lot of weight in the back so that it doesn't want to flip over when after it's fired. I'm just going to give it a little curl just to give the hat a little bit of character. One thing that can help too, if you feel like your gnome is a little back heavy, if you pinch out this base shape that you started with, or even get like a tool in there and kind of get the back to come out a little bit more, you can sort of counterbalance that so that the hat doesn't, there's more surface on the bottom to be able to hold up the weight from this hat. All right, so this is your basic gnome. From here, you can start adding like cute details that are going to make it more personable or more personal to you. So I'm going to start by adding some little feet because I just think they look cute. Again, I'm just going to add some basic feet. Before I attach them, I just want to roll out, or I'm just going to roll up 2 pieces of clay into ball size, and I'm going to make sure that they're the same size. I'm going to roll out 2 pieces of clay into little balls, and I'm going to make sure that they're the same size. That way my feet will come out looking the same size. I won't have one giant foot and one little foot. So what I'm doing now is I'm just trying to flatten them out and give one side a flat edge and the other side curved, and them not to look so much like balls but more like little feet. You can see how they look. Once I'm happy with how they look, again, I score and add slip. Onto the little body, I'm going to do the same. And I'm just going to get them to push into place and stay. I'm going to use my paintbrush to kind of clean up anything that looks a little rough. There we go. It's my little gnome. So from here, your job is to add lots of little details that are going to make it very unique to your idea. So whatever your idea might be, the places that you can think about adding details would be like the hat, or if you wanted your gnome to be, you know, to have a different type of shoe, or whatever you want your gnome to have. But I want you to think 3-dimensionally. I don't want you to think flat. So what flat would look like would be if you wanted flowers on the hat, drawing the flowers in. Instead of drawing the flowers in, what I want you to do is take little pieces of clay, and I want you to actually sculpt little flowers that you will then add 3-dimensionally. Might be a little too big. So let's say I wanted to give my gnome a little flower here, and I can make some petals. All right, so I'm just gonna show you, you get the idea, like to have this actually turn out to look like a flower and not to be just something that's drawn on. I wanna see lots of 3-dimensional details. It should be very clear without having to add color what your gnome is all about. So what your idea is, or the personality of your gnome, should be very clear without having to add too much color. The color, of course, can assist in helping us, but we want to know what's going on, and I don't want to hear, well, I'm going to paint this that color. I want to see what it looks like. So let's say you wanted to make his hat look striped. Instead of just painting it 2 different colors, you could take different pieces of clay and actually separate out so that it looks like it has stripes without actually having to show it through color. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. All right, lots of little details. Think about personalities. It does not have to have a beard. You can make hair on the side of it if you wanted to. Instead of putting the beard here, you can make 2 of these and put them on the side and make it look like it has hair, so it can become a female. It doesn't have to look just like this gnome. All right, get creative. One thing that I didn't really mention, but it should be mentioned, as I was attaching this little flower, I was just kind of placing it here, but see how I can just pull all of this off so easily? Once you like what you've designed and you're committing to the idea, you have to make sure that you score and slip the pieces. If you do not add the scoring and the slip, I don't want you to be sad if they fall off. So I'm just going to pre-score all those edges and then go back and add on my little pieces. If your clay is really dry, you want to do a really good job scoring and slipping. If your clay is on the wetter side, then you don't have to score and slip as much. Like if you noticed in the beginning, I was just scoring one side. So I scored here, but I didn't really score these guys. My clay is pretty wet. It's fresh out of the bag, so I wasn't worried too much about scoring and slipping and adding those on. All right, but the start of my little flower. You'll see it finished, I'm sure, later on.